going to start on you, Renee.
Okay, now?
Yeah.
We're back. Just a little bit of a technology problem there. I would imagine by now that you are accustomed to waiting around if something seems to be going wrong during Sunday school. Thank you. We have all learned about patience. What happens from my perspective is that Jamie starts frowning, Kimani's also helping, some people are moving around and looking strange, and I know that something's going on, but we're glad you hang in there. Maybe that's the time when you go back and pour one more cup of coffee. Maybe that's the habit that we've developed. But we're back. And we were talking about being able to see any parable, any scripture from a unique perspective when the scripture just describes something that you know about. And I remember you searching in our last study of the parables for the parable that you wanted to teach, and you got to the parable of the yeast and the person making bread, and your thought was what?
I don't know anything about yeast. I don't even really know what yeast is. So, can't talk about this parable because
Just
I don't
move
know what
on.
yeast is. Just let's find something else.
So think about such a rural setting for a lot of Jesus teaching.
Yeah.
And an understanding of sheep management or rural life, growing crops, all of that really challenges folks who grew up in a city, who never had any sheep around. And we're going to get a really wonderful bird's eye view of how a shepherd looks at this psalm and how this psalm informed his life and his life's work. And I think it's going to be really interesting. So what Philip Keller does in this book is one chapter at a time, take the sentences from Psalm 23. Today we're looking at chapter 1, The Lord is my shepherd. So here is a little insight, and then we'll come back, Jamie, and talk about this. As Keller is writing, he says, obviously David, King David, in this psalm, is speaking not as the shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd, though he was one, but he's speaking as a sheep of the flock. He spoke with a strong sense of pride and devotion to the shepherd. It was as though David literally boasted aloud, look at who my shepherd is. He knew from firsthand experience that the lot in life of any particular sheep depended on the type of person who owned it. Some owners were gentle, kind, intelligent, brave, and selfless in their devotion to their stock. Under one owner, sheep would struggle, starve, and suffer endless hardship. In another's case, they would flourish and thrive contentedly. And then Philip Keller describes this scene from his own time with sheep. In memory, I can still see one of the sheep ranchers in our district, which was operated by a tenant sheepman. He ought never to have been allowed to keep sheep. His stock were always thin, weak, riddled with disease or parasites. Again and again, they would come and stand at the fence staring blankly through the woven wire of the green, lush pastures which my flock enjoyed. What do you think about that perspective on the character of the shepherd determines the experience of the sheep?
You know, I had never considered it from this perspective before, but it makes a ton of sense. I mean, if you think about kind of any relationship that is somewhat unbalanced like that, it is really dependent on the person in power for how the other person in the relationship is doing. You think about parents and children, or parents and pets, or ministers in a congregation. If there is someone in that position of power who probably shouldn't be in that position of power, then you're going to see the results of that in the community. And the inverse is absolutely true as well. If you see a minister who is capable and authentic and passionate and truly called, then you're going to see a congregation that's thriving.
That's a good observation. That's right. So all dependent. To think that there are people, we think, who shouldn't own pets.
Probably.
Because they're not good to their pets. And
Yeah.
probably people who shouldn't have had children, perhaps, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And there are people who shouldn't keep sheep because sheep are so totally dependent. And Keller has this example of a nearby sheep ranch and sheep that really weren't that must be hard, would have been hard for him to be so diligent in his care of his flock and see somebody being so neglectful on the other side of the fence.
Absolutely.
So he can't quite get, I imagine he would want to rescue that flock if he could, but that might be stealing.
I think it would be theft, sheep theft.
Cut a hole in the fence and say, come on over. So one of the things that Keller says now is, if the Lord is my shepherd, I should know something of God's character and understand something of God's ability. That pivotal relationship between the shepherd and the sheep, all dependent on the character of the shepherd. Let's think about our shepherd. And he has a wonderful essay. I hope that you will read the book. I couldn't capture it all in the time that we have and the slides that we have. But Keller talks about the shepherd that he belongs to as the one who created the galaxies and the microorganisms in a handful of soil, the stuff of life, everything in between. That is the shepherd that Philip Keller is identifying with. And look at this quote. He writes, "It immediately implies a profound yet practical working relationship between a human being and his or her maker. It links the common clay to divine destiny. It means a mere mortal becomes the cherished object of divine diligence." I just think that's exquisite. What do you think of that quote, Jamie?
I really love that quote. You know, when we're talking with youth and we're trying to set something up from a theological standpoint, we really always start from this idea of God as creator. You know, we say, all right, if we're trying to kind of wrap our arms around who God is, let's just start with the understanding that God created everything. And in the midst of God creating everything, God took the time intentionally to make you exactly who you are. And so just kind of setting it up in that way to talk about the significance of all that God has already done, and that God took the time to make you exactly who you are, gives you kind of that sense of, I'm important to God, just like a sheep is important to the shepherd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the expansiveness. I think always, we're always challenged that our God is too small, which is another book, but always challenged by the vast scope of who God is and what we know about God's character to understand if we were a shepherd thinking about a flock. This is an awesome shepherd. This is a shepherd capable of so much and yet so focused on the care of finite creatures. So I think that he's done a great job of stimulating our imagination. There are so many great shepherd paintings. And so as we're working our way through this series, I'll be sharing some of the ones that I've found that I really love. But as we look at one of those, Julien Dupré of France, this beautiful, the shepherd, portrait of the shepherd and the sheepdog looking out over the flock. I want you to hear another little interlude that Philip Keller writes. Jamie's going to read it to us. Would you read that?
Absolutely. So Keller says, "I recall quite clearly how in my first venture with sheep, the question of paying a price for my ewes was so terribly important. They belonged to me only by virtue of the fact that I had paid hard cash for them. It was money earned by the blood and sweat and tears drawn from my own body during the desperate grinding years of the Depression. And when I bought that first small flock, I was buying them literally with my own body, which had been laid down with this day in mind. Because of this, I felt in a special way that they were in very truth a part of me and I a part of them. There was an intimate identity involved, which, though not apparent on the surface to the casual observer, nonetheless made those 30 ewes exceedingly precious to me. But the day I bought them, I also realized that this was but the first stage in a long, lasting endeavor in which from then on I would, as their owner, have to continually lay my life down for them if they were to flourish and prosper. Sheep do not just take care of themselves, as some might suppose. They require, more than any other class of livestock, endless attention and meticulous care.
It's important for us to know, isn't it?
Yes.
More care and attention than any other class
I
of
resonate
livestock.
with that last sentence tremendously.
because
I
that's
require endless attention and meticulous care.
So you identify with that. So tell me what you're thinking about this connection as he describes it. The first, how many ewes that he buys?
30.
30
So he bought
ewes
30 ewes. And
to start his flock.
you know, we're teaching the boys right now at home, like the benefit of saving up for something that you really want, and the labor that kind of comes with earning the money that you have to save up. Especially with our 6-year-old, he bought like a dart gun the other day for $12, and he had taken out the trash, and now he's starting to take care of the dogs, and so he'd been doing things to earn that money.
Good lesson for
Right,
Cohen.
and so I hear a lot of that, and it's just the effort in that you put in even before the thing ever happens, in order for the thing to happen.
Anticipating.
The anticipatory work,
Yeah.
and the sweats and the effort just to get to reach that one goal, and then you achieve that goal, and he said, wait, the work's not over yet, because now that I've achieved this goal, there are higher goals that I have to attain to care for these sheep well, and just to do all of those other things. And so I really like this imagery of the job's not done for God with us, and the job's not done for the shepherd with the sheep, because just because we're here and in this relationship now, that's not the end all be all.
Right.
The end all be all is thriving and having that attention and that care given to us and returned. And so I really like that.
I think it's really a wonderful description. I know that we live in times, not just in these times, but I know there's a resistance to this whole idea of thinking about our relationship with God as an owner and an animal that requires more attention and care than any other livestock, and that it doesn't seem flattering. And so we've already discussed that we're letting a shepherd teach us, explain to us how he receives this particular scripture. Are you feeling resistant to being compared in terms of your walk with God to some creatures who are helpless?
Yeah, I do kind of bristle, I think, at the idea of being a sheep, but I think every metaphor has its breaking point. And so it's really important when we're working with a metaphor like this one to stay within the boundaries that are appropriate. And I don't think that calling people mindless and saying that they follow mindlessly a God who tells them how to live their daily life and what to do.
Just like a robot.
That's not, I don't think that's what we're going for here. And I don't think that's what the psalmist was going for either. I think that there is tremendous takeaway from this psalm, especially when we start to talk about how sheep thrive in community under the care of a good shepherd. We know the parable of the lost sheep as well. We have that to pair with this psalm about the effort that a good shepherd goes to seek out the one lost sheep, to bring them back into the fold of that safe and caring and loving community. And so I think there's a very communal aspect to this psalm of what it means to thrive in the midst of a loving and caring community with the ultimate caretaker at
with
the
the
helm.
provision, with God's provision.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've really been watching God providing through this
It has been
liminal
extraordinary.
time that we're living in, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. Just the work that the church has continued to do. We had the opportunity last week to sit down with JB and talk a lot about what the outreach ministry here has been doing, and to talk with our partners at Week of Compassion about all of the stuff that they're doing in the midst of a pandemic. If you haven't watched that yet, go back. It's still in the feed on Facebook to just see JB's conversation with Caroline Hamilton Arnold over at Week of Compassion. It was a tremendous conversation. But yeah, God has certainly come through and broken through in the midst of this chaos, and God is still very, very clearly guiding and providing.
And possibly we identify more with sheep because we have all felt a little helpless.
Yeah.
We've thought about how things like All Church Sunday School were set up in March.
Yeah.
That's kind of a lark for a few weeks. We're still
we are in
here
August.
enjoying Sunday school. I love that Sunday school's care and the shepherd's direction. So here's another quote from his first chapter. It is a tragic truth, he writes, that many people who really have never come under God's direction or management, those are of course sheep management terms, those people claim the Lord is my shepherd. They seem to hope that by merely stating that God is their shepherd, they will somehow enjoy the benefits of God's care and management without paying the price of forfeiting their own fickle and foolish way of life. Does that seem a little harsh to you, Jamie, that comment?
On the surface,
Yes. But also, I think a lot of times we tend to maybe subscribe partially because we like the thought or the theory, but then we get into it kind of like Keller does when he gets his 30 U's, and then you realize that there's actual investment involved on the other side of that commitment. It's like we tell our kids after baptism class, like, you don't get baptized and then, all right, cool, you're done. We're good to go for the rest of our lives. No, the baptism is the beginning of this lifelong commitment and journey. And so when we see, this resonates with me because, enjoying the benefits of God's care and management without paying the price for us, the cost of discipleship really is that we have to have skin in the game too. Like,
Right.
It's not
Or
just
fleece.
or fleece in the game too. Yeah, we're knitting a sweater over here, and so it's really more about, hey, God has this incredible a promise that you can live into, but God also says we've got to work together to do some really important things.
So there's a discipleship pathway, and we'll talk about that when we start next week.
Yeah.
I'll bring that back up. That's something that University Christian Church has been working on across 2020, and maybe we need to be reminded, look at that pathway. Is the pathway for following the shepherd in the case of Psalm 23. And it isn't, to claim the Lord is my shepherd implies some submission,
yeah.
following, obedience, understanding what God plans for our lives and wants for our lives, and that would require some time in Scripture, understanding how we give our talents and our time and our treasures back to God. So we'll just start with that next week as a reminder, and then continue in this wonderful book. I really recommend it. It's an older book with some older language. Here it is. But it's a lovely short book.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier
A
to
quick
read
read.
than the parables text. And it's just lovely, especially if we'd love to hear from you if you have some experience with sheep, raised in some sort of setting where you know something about sheep and can tell us, do you think the writing of Philip Keller rings true for you? How do you feel about Psalm 23? And you can also send us an email if this comparison with sheep gets under your skin, and we will entertain all comments and always be glad to hear from you. The email address is renee.hoke, R-E-N-E-E, renee.hoke@uccftw.com. Let us know what you're thinking about this series, and we'll be on to chapter 2 next week. Any parting comments, Jamie?
I would be worried if you weren't pushing back.
Right. So push away, and that'll help us. We'd like for this to be two-way conversation. So we'd love to hear from you so that we can include your comments and your questions as we begin next week. In the meantime, stay safe and follow the shepherd. We'll see you soon.